92. They assigned her cleanup duty, then she found evidence that prevented next attack. They assigned her cleanup duty, then she found evidence that prevented next attack. Intro hook 30 seconds. The explosion that never happened would have killed 347 people. But nobody knew that yet as Irene Hill pushed her cleaning cart down the empty corridor of the European Intelligence Coordination Center at 4:47 in the morning. Her hands, small and calloused from months of scrubbing floors that analysts walked across without seeing her, gripped the mop handle with the same determination she'd once brought to her counterterrorism training. They demoted her to janitorial duty 6 months ago, calling her too emotional, too impulsive for real intelligence work. What they didn't know was that invisible people see everything. And today, while emptying a trash bin most officers ignored, she would find a fragment of evidence that everyone else had missed, a discovery that would force her to choose between following protocol and saving hundreds of lives. CTA. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Part 1 800 words. The morning shift at the European Intelligence Coordination Center in Brussels began the same way it had for the past 183 days. Irene Hill arrived at 4:30 a.m., changed into her gray custodial uniform in a locker room that smelled of disinfectant and resignation, and began her rounds through corridors where decisions affecting millions of lives were made by people who never learned her name. At 26, Irene had once been one of those decision-makers. She'd graduated top of her class from the European Intelligence Academy, spoke 5 languages fluently, and had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in seemingly unrelated data. Her instructors had called her brilliant. Her psychological evaluations had called her something else, emotionally volatile, prone to passionate outbursts, unable to maintain the cool detachment required for high-level intelligence work. The incident that ended her career as an analyst had happened on a Tuesday morning, 6 months and 4 days ago. During a briefing on potential terrorist threats, she'd challenged senior analyst Victor Rousseau's assessment of a surveillance report from Marseille. The data showed anomalies that everyone else dismissed as coincidental, but Irene had seen a pattern, had felt in her gut that something was being missed. When Rousseau dismissed her concerns with a patronizing smile, something inside Irene had snapped. She'd raised her voice, had accused him of intellectual laziness, had insisted that lives were at stake while he worried about his reputation. The confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it had been enough. By that afternoon, she'd been reassigned to facility maintenance pending a full psychological review. The review had been thorough and damning. Specialist Hill demonstrates exceptional analytical capabilities, the report concluded. However, her emotional responses and inability to accept hierarchical decision-making structures make her unsuitable for positions requiring collaborative intelligence assessment. Recommendation: reassignment to support services with reduced security clearance. Support services. A clinical term for scrubbing toilets and emptying trash bins in a building where she'd once helped track international terrorist networks. Irene pushed her cart through the third-floor corridor, her footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn silence. The analysts would arrive in 2 hours, flooding the building with their confident voices and expensive coffee. They would discuss threats and countermeasures, would analyze intercepts and satellite imagery, would never once look at the woman who cleaned their offices and had once been smarter than most of them. She'd learned to be invisible. It was easier than facing the mixture of pity and satisfaction in the eyes of former colleagues who'd always resented her success. Victor Rousseau, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in leaving his office particularly messy, as if reminding her of how far she'd fallen. This morning, she started with the conference rooms on the East Wing. Conference Room 7 had hosted a late-night session the previous evening. She could tell by the empty coffee cups and the scattered papers that someone had forgotten to secure in the classified document safe. This happened more often than the public would believe. Brilliant analysts could be careless about basic security protocols, especially when working late on cases they considered routine. Irene collected the coffee cups and wiped down the conference table. She wasn't supposed to look at classified materials, wasn't supposed to even acknowledge their presence. Protocol required her to report any unsecured documents to the security office, where they would be logged and returned to their owners with a formal reprimand. But old habits died hard. As she reached for a stack of papers to place in the secure bin by the door, her eyes caught a fragment of text on a surveillance transcript. It was written in Arabic, a language she'd studied for 3 years and could read as easily as English. Most of the cleaning staff wouldn't have understood it. Most of the analysts wouldn't have given it a second glance. It was marked as a routine intercept from a known low-level operative. But Irene saw something that made her blood turn cold. A phrase, just 4 words, that didn't belong in a routine communication. A phrase that suggested this wasn't a low-level operative at all, but someone using a cipher that the preliminary assessment had completely missed. She stood frozen, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. Every protocol screamed at her to put it down, to report it through proper channels, to let the qualified analysts handle it. But she remembered Marseille, remembered being right when everyone else was wrong, remembered 6 months of scrubbing floors because she'd cared too much about being right instead of being quiet. Irene carefully placed the document in the secure bin and continued her cleaning rounds. But her mind was racing, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations from the past week, remembered faces of analysts who'd worked late on what they'd called a routine monitoring operation. Something was very wrong. And she was probably the only person in the building who could see it. The rest of Irene's shift passed in a blur of mechanical motion and mental calculation. She mopped floors while her mind dissected that 4-word phrase in Arabic. She emptied trash bins while reconstructing fragments of conversations she'd overheard between analysts who spoke freely around cleaning staff, as if she were furniture rather than a person with security clearance and training. By the time the morning shift analysts began arriving at 7 a.m., Irene had reached a conclusion that terrified her. The phrase she'd seen, "the garden blooms in autumn," wasn't just unusual. It was a known activation code that had appeared in 3 previous terrorist communications over the past 18 months. Each time, it had preceded a major attack by exactly 11 days. The problem was that the current analysis team had classified the intercept as low priority because the source was considered unreliable. They'd applied an algorithmic assessment that weighted source credibility over content analysis. It was efficient, it was logical, and it was potentially fatal. Irene knew she should report her concerns through proper channels. But she also knew exactly what would happen. Her observation would be logged, reviewed by the same analysts who'd already dismissed the intercept as routine, and ultimately ignored because it came from someone deemed too emotional for intelligence work. By the time anyone took her seriously, if they ever did, 11 days might have passed. She changed out of her custodial uniform at 8:30 a.m. and walked through the building's main atrium. The space hummed with purposeful activity as analysts hurried to their stations, administrators coordinated briefings, and security personnel monitored access points. Irene recognized many faces, former colleagues who now looked through her rather than at her. Near the security checkpoint, she spotted Director Catherine Laurent, the head of the Counterterrorism Analysis Division. Laurent was 53, brilliant, and notoriously impatient with anyone who wasted her time. She'd been the one who signed off on Irene's reassignment, had written in the evaluation that passion without discipline is a liability in intelligence work. Irene approached before she could second-guess herself. "Director Laurent, I need to speak with you about a surveillance intercept from the Marseille network." Laurent looked up from her tablet, her expression shifting from neutral to coldly dismissive as she recognized Irene. "Miss Hill, I believe your current assignment doesn't involve surveillance analysis." "I found an unsecured document in conference room 7, Irene said, keeping her voice level despite the anxiety clawing at her chest. It contained an activation phrase that matches patterns from previous attacks. "Then you should have reported it to security, not approached me directly," Laurent replied. "And you certainly shouldn't have read classified materials that are above your current clearance level." With respect, Director, the phrase "the garden blooms in autumn" appeared in communications before the Vienna transport bombing and the Amsterdam museum attack. If this follows the same pattern, we have 11 days before. "Enough." Laurent's voice cut through Irene's explanation like a blade. "The intercept you're referring to has already been assessed by qualified analysts and deemed low priority. Your enthusiasm for pattern recognition is noted, but it doesn't change the fact that you're no longer in a position to make these determinations. Other people were watching now, drawn by the confrontation. Irene recognized Victor Rousseau among them, his expression a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. Director, I understand that my reassignment was due to my inability to control my emotional responses, Irene said, choosing each word carefully. But my analytical capabilities haven't changed. If there's even a possibility that this intercept is significant. Your analytical capabilities are irrelevant if you can't work within the established framework, Laurent interrupted. We have protocols for a reason, Miss Hill. We have hierarchies and assessment procedures specifically to prevent the kind of impulsive decision-making that led to your reassignment. So you're saying that even if I'm right, even if there's a credible threat, it doesn't matter because I'm not following the proper chain of command? Laurent's expression hardened. I'm saying that your history of emotional outbursts and inability to accept professional judgment makes you an unreliable source. The intercept has been properly assessed. Your job is to clean facilities, not to second-guess qualified intelligence officers. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Around them, conversations had stopped. Irene could feel the weight of dozens of eyes, could sense the mixture of pity and schadenfreude from people who'd once been her peers. She nodded slowly, her face burning with humiliation and frustration. Understood, Director. As she turned to leave, Rousseau's voice carried across the atrium, pitched just loud enough for her to hear. Some people never learn their place. Irene kept walking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But her mind was already working, calculating, planning. She had 11 days to prove she was right. And this time, she couldn't afford to let emotion cloud her judgment, no matter how justified her anger might be. Irene spent the rest of that day in a careful dance between duty and obsession. She completed her cleaning assignments with mechanical efficiency while her mind worked through the problem from every angle. The intercept she'd seen wasn't just similar to previous activation codes, it was identical in structure and timing. The probability of coincidence was astronomically low. But probability wasn't proof, and without access to the full intelligence database, she couldn't build the case that would convince Laurent or anyone else in authority. Her current security clearance gave her access to custodial schedules and supply inventories. Everything else, the surveillance reports, the pattern analysis tools, the classified communications networks, was locked behind digital walls she wasn't authorized to breach. That evening, after her shift ended, Irene sat in her small apartment in the Molenbeek district and stared at her laptop. She'd kept meticulous notes during her time as an analyst, personal observations and pattern recognition techniques that weren't classified but that showed her methodology. If she could recreate her analysis using only publicly available information, she might be able to build enough of a case to force someone to listen. She started with news reports from the past 18 months, searching for any incidents that might connect to the phrase "the garden blooms in autumn." The Vienna transport bombing had killed 17 people and wounded 43. The Amsterdam Museum attack had been thwarted at the last minute by Dutch security forces, but the planning had been extensive. Both had been attributed to a loose network of extremist cells operating across Western Europe. What connected them, beyond the activation phrase, was timing. Both attacks had occurred exactly 11 days after the phrase appeared in intercepted communications. Both had targeted high-traffic civilian locations during peak hours. And both had been preceded by a period of increased chatter from sources that intelligence agencies had previously classified as low priority. Irene created a timeline, mapping the intercepts against the attacks. The pattern was undeniable, at least to her. But she knew that pattern recognition was only valuable when supported by hard intelligence. She needed more than her instincts in her analysis. She needed evidence that would withstand the scrutiny of people who were already predisposed to dismiss anything she said. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When she opened it, her breath caught. It was a photograph of the surveillance intercept she'd seen that morning, the one from conference room 7. Below it, a message in French: "You were right to be concerned. But be careful. Not everyone wants the truth." A friend. Irene stared at the screen, her heart racing. Someone inside the intelligence center was watching, someone who had access to classified materials and the means to contact her anonymously. It could be a trap, a test to see if she would pursue unauthorized investigation. Or it could be genuine, someone who saw what she saw but couldn't speak openly without risking their own career. She deleted the message immediately, but not before memorizing every detail of the intercept photograph. The image showed more than she'd been able to read in her brief glimpse that morning. It included timestamps, source identifications, and preliminary assessment notes. The analyst who'd reviewed it had tagged it as routine monitoring, low probability threat assessment. That analyst's name was visible in the corner of the document, Victor Rousseau. Irene sat back, processing this information. Rousseau had dismissed the very intercept that matched a known activation pattern. Had he simply been careless, applying algorithmic analysis without deeper investigation? Or was something else happening, something that made him want this particular communication to be overlooked? She thought about the anonymous message, the warning to be careful. Someone inside the intelligence center was concerned enough to reach out to her, to validate her suspicions while warning her about danger. But who? And more importantly, could she trust them? Outside her window, Brussels settled into its evening rhythm. Somewhere in this city, or perhaps in another European capital, people were planning an attack that would kill hundreds. And she, relegated to cleaning floors and emptying trash bins, might be the only person who could stop it. Irene opened her laptop and began drafting a detailed analysis of everything she knew. If she was going to act on this, she needed to be absolutely certain. Emotion had cost her career once. This time, she would lead with evidence, with logic, with the kind of cold analytical precision that no one could dismiss. But even as she worked, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered the truth she'd been avoiding: evidence wouldn't be enough. The people in power had already decided she was unreliable. If she was going to stop this attack, she would have to do it alone. The next morning, Irene arrived at the intelligence center with a plan that terrified her. She would use her invisibility as an advantage, would leverage the fact that analysts and officers spoke freely around cleaning staff, treating them as part of the furniture rather than as people with ears and minds. Her shift began at 4:30 a.m., as always. But today, she paid attention to details she'd previously ignored. Which offices were left unlocked overnight? Which security cameras had blind spots? Where did analysts leave their access badges while they stepped away for coffee? She wasn't planning to steal anything or breach any systems. Not yet. But she needed to understand the building's rhythms, its vulnerabilities, its patterns. If the attack was going to happen in 10 days, she needed to gather enough evidence in that time to either convince someone in authority or to act independently. The anonymous message from the previous evening haunted her thoughts. Not everyone wants the truth. What did that mean? Was there active sabotage happening within the intelligence center? Or was it simply that institutional inertia and professional pride made people resistant to admitting they'd missed something critical? During her morning rounds, Irene cleaned Victor Rousseau's office. He arrived early, as he often did, settling into his chair with a cup of expensive coffee and an air of self-satisfaction that made her jaw tighten. She worked quietly, emptying his trash bin while he reviewed reports on his computer. "The cleaning staff comes earlier every day," Rousseau muttered, not looking at her. "Makes it difficult to work in peace." Irene bit back a response. To him, she was an annoyance, a reminder that even in an intelligence center, someone had to handle the mundane tasks that kept the facility running. He would never imagine that the woman pushing a mop cart had once been considered for a position senior to his own. As she wiped down his conference table, she noticed a folder marked with red classification stripes. It was the kind of carelessness that had let her see the original intercept, analysts who were so confident in their authority that they forgot basic security protocols. The folder was labeled Marseille Network Assessment, Week 43. Rousseau's phone rang, pulling his attention away. He swiveled his chair to face the window, speaking in rapid French about an unrelated case. Irene's hands moved automatically, her cleaning cloth working in smooth circles across the table surface. But her eyes were on that folder, on the edges of documents that peeked out from beneath the cover. She shouldn't look. She knew that. Every regulation, every protocol, every lesson from her training screamed at her to finish her work and leave. But somewhere in that folder might be additional context about the intercept, about why it had been dismissed, about whether there were other communications that formed a larger pattern. The phone conversation continued. Rousseau was arguing with someone about resource allocation, his voice rising with irritation. Irene made a decision that she knew she couldn't take back. She angled her body to block the folder from any security camera sightlines, lifted the cover just enough to photograph the top document with her phone, then smoothly closed it again. Her heart hammered as she finished cleaning the table and moved to empty the recycling bin. Rousseau ended his call and turned back to his computer without ever acknowledging her presence. To him, she was invisible. And right now, that invisibility was her greatest asset. Back in the custodial closet on the third floor, Irene reviewed the photograph she'd taken. It was slightly blurry but readable. What she saw made her blood run cold. The document was an assessment summary that concluded the Marseille network intercept was likely misdirection from a source with diminished credibility. But in the margins, someone had handwritten a note, recommend elevated monitoring despite low probability assessment. That note wasn't in Rousseau's handwriting. Someone else had reviewed this intercept and recommended further investigation. But that recommendation had been ignored, overridden by Rousseau's final assessment that deemed it unworthy of additional resources. Irene's phone buzzed. Another message from the unknown number, conference room 12. Third floor. 6 p.m. tonight. Come alone. She stared at the message, every instinct warning her that this could be a trap. Meeting an anonymous contact in an empty government building after hours violated every security protocol she'd ever learned. But she was already so far beyond protocol that one more violation hardly mattered. She deleted the message and went back to work, pushing her cart through corridors where people made decisions about life and death without ever seeing the woman who cleaned up after them. The hours until 6 p.m. crawled by with agonizing slowness. Irene completed her shift at noon, then spent the afternoon at a cafe near the Bourse, nursing coffee she barely tasted while reviewing everything she knew about the intercept and the pattern it represented. She drafted scenarios, calculated probabilities, and tried to imagine what evidence she would need to overcome the institutional resistance to her conclusions. By 5:30 p.m., she was back at the intelligence center, using her custodial access badge to enter through the service entrance. The building had a different character in the evening, quieter but not empty. Night shift analysts worked on ongoing cases, and security personnel maintained their constant vigilance. Irene's presence wasn't unusual. Cleaning staff often returned for evening shifts or to handle special requests from late working officers. She made her way to the third floor, pushing an unnecessary cleaning cart to maintain her cover. Conference room 12 was at the end of a corridor that saw less foot traffic than the main briefing areas. It was used primarily for small group meetings and classified video conferences. The lights were off when she arrived, the room appearing empty through the narrow window in the door. Irene checked her watch, 5:58 p.m. She positioned her cart near the door and pretended to clean the corridor windows, watching for any sign of who had sent the messages. At exactly 6 p.m., the door to conference room 12 opened from the inside. A woman in her mid-40s stood in the doorway, her face partially shadowed but recognizable. Dr. Elise Fournier. Senior analyst in the Threat Assessment Division and one of the few people who had spoken against Irene's reassignment 6 months ago. She'd argued that emotional passion could be channeled into analytical rigor, that dismissing someone for caring too much was a mistake. But she'd been overruled by Director Laurent and the review board. Coming quickly, Fournier said in French, her voice barely above a whisper. We don't have much time. Irene hesitated only a moment before leaving her cart in the corridor and stepping into the darkened conference room. Fournier closed the door and activated a portable signal jammer on the table, a device that would prevent any electronic surveillance of their conversation. You've been asking dangerous questions, Fournier said, studying Irene with an expression that mixed concern and calculation. "The intercept you found, the one with the activation phrase. You're right to be worried about it. Then why was it dismissed as low priority?" Irene asked. "The pattern is undeniable. 3 previous uses of that phrase, 3 attacks. This isn't coincidence." Fournier pulled out a tablet and displayed a series of documents that Irene recognized as internal assessment reports. "Because Victor Rousseau is protecting someone. Or something. I've been tracking his analysis patterns for 3 months, and there's a consistent bias in how he evaluates intercepts from the Marseille network. He systematically downgrades threat assessments from certain sources." "Why would he do that?" Irene asked, though the implications were already forming in her mind like pieces of a terrible puzzle. "I don't know yet," Fournier admitted. "It could be incompetence. It could be that he's being manipulated by someone feeding him bad intelligence. Or it could be something worse." She paused, meeting Irene's eyes directly. "It could be that he's compromised." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. A compromised analyst inside the European Intelligence Coordination Center could do incalculable damage, could steer investigations away from real threats, could ensure that attacks succeeded by making certain that warning signs were ignored. "If you suspect he's compromised, why not report it through proper channels?" Irene asked. "Because I'm not certain, and an accusation like that against a senior analyst requires ironclad evidence," Fournier replied. "Evidence I don't have." "But you," she gestured at Irene, "you've already been dismissed as too emotional, too unreliable. If you investigate this and you're wrong, you lose nothing because you've already lost everything. If you're right, you save lives and possibly expose a serious security breach." Irene felt a cold clarity settle over her. "You want me to do the investigation that you can't do officially. You want me to use my access as cleaning staff to gather evidence." "I want you to follow your instincts," Fournier corrected. "The same instincts that made you the best pattern analyst in your class. The same instincts that got you reassigned because you refused to ignore what others dismissed." She pulled out a small USB drive and placed it on the table. "This contains copies of all the Marseille network intercepts from the past 6 months, including assessments from multiple analysts. You'll see the pattern of Rousseau's downgrades. What you do with that information is your choice." Irene stared at the USB drive as if it were a live explosive. Accepting it would cross a line from which there was no return. She would be knowingly accessing classified materials that were far beyond her current security clearance. If she was caught, she wouldn't just lose her job, she could face criminal charges. "Why are you doing this?" Irene asked Fournier. "Why risk your career to help me?" Fournier's expression softened slightly. "Because 6 months ago, I watched talented analysts get destroyed for caring too much about getting things right. Because I've spent 22 years in intelligence work, and I've learned that sometimes the system protects itself more than it protects the people it's meant to serve." She paused. "And because I have a daughter who's studying at the Sorbonne. If there's an attack coming, if we could prevent it but don't because of institutional pride or bureaucratic inertia, I'll never forgive myself." The mention of her daughter was a vulnerability, a human detail that made Fournier's motivations clear. This wasn't about exposing corruption or settling scores. It was about a mother who understood that the stakes were measured in lives, not careers. Irene picked up the USB drive, feeling its weight in her palm. "If I find evidence that Rousseau is compromised, or that there's a credible threat, how do I report it? Laurent already dismissed me once. She's not going to listen to anything I say." "Then you don't go through Laurent," Fournier said. "You go above her. Director General Thomas Moreau oversees the entire coordination center. He's a pragmatist who cares more about results than protocol. If you bring him solid evidence, he'll listen. And if I'm wrong? If I investigate this and discover that there's no threat, that I'm seeing patterns where none exist." Fournier smiled sadly. "Then you'll have confirmed what everyone already believes about you. But at least you'll know you tried." She checked her watch. "I have to go. A meeting with the night shift supervisors that I can't miss without raising questions." Be careful, Irene. If Rousseau is compromised, he may have allies in the building. Trust no one except yourself. She deactivated the signal jammer and slipped out of the conference room, leaving Irene alone with the USB drive and a decision that would define the rest of her life. That night, in her apartment, Irene plugged the USB drive into her personal laptop. She'd disconnected the computer from the internet and disabled all wireless connections, taking every precaution to ensure that whatever she found wouldn't be traced back to her or to Fournier. The files were organized by date and source, hundreds of intercepts from the Marseille network spanning 6 months. Irene began reading systematically, noting Rousseau's assessment comments on each document. The pattern Fournier had mentioned became clear within the first hour. Any intercept that came from certain sources within the network was automatically downgraded, regardless of content. But it was the cross-referencing that revealed the true scope of the problem. Irene pulled up publicly available information about terrorist activities in Western Europe over the past 6 months. 3 attempted attacks had been thwarted by local police based on tips from informants. 5 smaller incidents had occurred that intelligence agencies had later connected to the Marseille network. In every case, there had been an intercept that preceded the activity, an intercept that Rousseau had assessed and downgraded. The probability of coincidence was now beyond astronomical. It was impossible. Either Victor Rousseau was catastrophically incompetent, or he was deliberately ensuring that certain threats went undetected. Irene pulled up the most recent intercept, the one with the activation phrase "the garden blooms in autumn." She studied every detail, every nuance of the language. And then she saw it, hidden in the metadata that most analysts would never examine carefully. The intercept had been forwarded through a relay server before reaching the intelligence center's monitoring systems. That relay had added a microsecond delay and a barely detectable alteration to the timestamp. Someone was manipulating the intercepts before they reached analysis. Someone with access to the center's incoming data streams. Someone who could make threatening communications appear routine and urgent warnings seem like background noise. Irene sat back from her computer, her mind racing. This wasn't just about one analyst making bad decisions. This was about a systematic compromise of the intelligence center's ability to detect and prevent terrorist attacks. And somewhere in Brussels, with 9 days remaining before the pattern suggested an attack would occur, people were going about their lives completely unaware of the danger. She thought about Fournier's words, "Trust no one except yourself." If the data stream was compromised, then the corruption might extend beyond Rousseau. There could be others involved, others who would do anything to keep their activities hidden. Irene made her decision. She would investigate, would gather the evidence, would find out where the attack was being planned and how to stop it. And she would do it alone, using the very invisibility that had been forced upon her as both weapon and shield. After all, no one paid attention to the woman who cleaned their offices. And that meant no one would see her coming. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The following morning, Irene began her shift with a new sense of purpose that she carefully hid behind the mask of dutiful compliance. She pushed her cleaning cart through the familiar corridors, but now every movement was calculated, every action part of a larger plan. She wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was conducting an unauthorized investigation that could either save hundreds of lives or end with her in a prison cell. Her first objective was to identify who had access to the data relay systems that processed incoming intercepts. The intelligence center's technical infrastructure was managed by a small team of specialists who worked in a secure facility on the basement level. Irene had cleaned those offices before, had seen the complex arrays of servers and monitoring equipment that formed the backbone of European counterterrorism coordination. During her morning break, she reviewed the building's personnel directory that was accessible to all staff. The technical operations team consisted of 8 people, led by a supervisor named André Petit. She cross-referenced their names with her memories of conversations overheard, of behavioral patterns observed during months of invisible presence in their workspace. One name stood out, Jules Marchand, a junior systems administrator who had been with the center for only 8 months. In that time, according to snippets of conversation Irene had heard, Marchand had requested unusual levels of access to data processing systems, citing optimization needs. His requests had been approved by Rousseau, who served on the Technical Oversight Committee. Irene made a note to pay special attention to Marchand's workspace during her afternoon cleaning rounds. But first, she needed to understand the timing of the activation phrase intercept. If someone had manipulated the metadata, they would have done it at a specific point in the data processing chain. Finding that point would help her identify who had the capability and opportunity. At 10:30 a.m., she was cleaning the break room on the second floor when she overheard a conversation that made her pause. 2 analysts from the communications intelligence section were discussing a system glitch that had occurred 2 days ago, around the same time the activation phrase intercept would have been processed. The relay server went offline for about 90 seconds, one analyst was saying. Petit said it was a routine maintenance issue, but the timing was odd. Right in the middle of peak processing hours. Did they lose any data? The second analyst asked. No, everything was buffered and processed once the system came back online. But Marchand was working on it alone, which seems irregular for a critical system. Irene continued wiping down the counter, her mind racing. A 90-second window during peak processing hours would be exactly what someone would need to manipulate an intercept's metadata. And Marchand had been alone with the system when it happened. She finished the break room and headed toward the basement level, where the technical operations offices were located. Her cleaning schedule gave her legitimate access to the area twice per week, and today was one of those days. As she descended the stairs, she mentally rehearsed the approach she would take. The basement was cooler than the upper floors, humming with the white noise of climate control systems keeping the servers at optimal temperature. Irene badged through the security door and found the technical operations area mostly empty. Most of the team worked upstairs during daylight hours, monitoring systems remotely. Only a skeleton crew remained in the basement. Jules Marchand sat at his workstation, his back to the door, headphones covering his ears as he typed rapidly on his keyboard. Irene entered quietly, noting the multiple monitors displaying code and system logs. She began her cleaning routine, working methodically while observing Marchand's screens in her peripheral vision. On one monitor, she could see what appeared to be a chat window, though she couldn't read the text from her angle. On another, system logs scrolled past too quickly for her to process. But on the third monitor, briefly visible before Marchand minimized the window, was something that made her heart skip, a list of intercept identification codes, with timestamps that matched the period when the activation phrase communication had been received. Marchand suddenly turned in his chair, pulling off his headphones. Irene kept her focus on emptying the trash bin beside his desk, her expression neutral and disinterested. "You're the cleaning woman," Marchand said in French, his tone dismissive. "You're early today." "Schedule adjustment," Irene replied without looking at him, maintaining the subservient demeanor that made her invisible to most staff. "I'll be finished in a few minutes." Marchand grunted and turned back to his screens, but not before Irene noticed something that sent ice through her veins. On his left wrist, partially covered by his sleeve, was a tattoo. Just 3 letters in Arabic script. She couldn't see the full design, but what she could see was enough to recognize it as potential extremist symbolism. She finished cleaning his area and moved on to the other workstations, her mind racing. A systems administrator with possible extremist connections, working alone during a suspicious system outage, with access to intercept processing systems. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture far more sinister than simple analytical incompetence. Irene spent the rest of her shift in a state of controlled urgency. She couldn't confront Marchand or report her suspicions without more concrete evidence. A tattoo wasn't proof of anything, and her history of being too emotional meant that any accusation she made would be dismissed as paranoid speculation. She needed documentation, proof that would withstand scrutiny from people who already doubted her judgment. That evening, she met with Fournier again, this time in a small park near the European Quarter. They sat on separate benches, speaking quietly in French while pretending to read newspapers. Irene described what she discovered about Marchand, about the system outage, about the tattoo that might mean nothing or might mean everything. "I need to access his workstation," Irene said. "I need to see what he's doing with those intercept codes." Fournier shook her head. "That's too dangerous. The technical operations area has security cameras. If you're caught accessing his computer, it's not just your career that's finished. It's a criminal offense." "Then what do you suggest?" Irene asked, frustration bleeding into her voice. "We have 8 days left before the pattern suggests an attack. 8 days to find enough evidence to convince people who have already decided I'm unreliable." "We need to be smart about this," Fournier replied. "Marchand's computer is monitored and logged. But his personal devices aren't. If he's involved in something, he's probably using encrypted communications on his phone or a personal laptop. That's where we'll find the real evidence." "How am I supposed to access his personal devices?" Fournier finally looked at her directly. "Your cleaning staff. You have access to the locker rooms, to personal storage areas. If Marchand leaves his bag or jacket unattended, you have opportunities that a regular analyst would never have." Irene felt the weight of what Fournier was suggesting. She was already compromising her integrity by accessing classified files. Now she was being asked to essentially search someone's personal belongings without authorization. It was a clear violation not just of regulations but of basic privacy rights. "If I do this and I'm wrong," Irene said slowly, "if Marchand is innocent and I've invaded his privacy based on nothing more than a suspicious tattoo and some circumstantial timing, then I'm not just unreliable. I'm a criminal. And if you don't do it and 300 people die in 8 days? Fournier countered. "Can you live with that choice?" The question hung between them like a blade. Irene thought about the Vienna bombing, about the 17 people who had died because an activation phrase had been missed or ignored. She thought about the Amsterdam attack that had nearly succeeded, about the hundreds who would have died if Dutch security hadn't gotten lucky at the last moment. "I need to know one thing," Irene said. "If I find evidence, if I prove that Marchand and Rousseau are involved in facilitating an attack, will you back me up? Will you verify what I've found so that it's not just the word of a disgraced analyst?" Fournier was silent for a long moment. "If you find real evidence, yes. I'll risk my career to support you. But the evidence has to be airtight, Irene. It has to be so clear that even your harshest critics can't dismiss it." They parted ways without another word. Irene walked back to her apartment through streets filled with people enjoying the evening, couples at sidewalk cafes, tourists photographing the illuminated Grand Place, office workers heading home after long days. All of them unaware that somewhere in this city, a clock was counting down toward an attack that might kill hundreds. The next morning, Irene arrived at the intelligence center with a small wireless device hidden in her cleaning supplies. It was a data transfer tool that Fournier had provided, capable of copying the contents of a phone or computer in less than 2 minutes if she could get physical access. The device was illegal for unauthorized use, and simply possessing it inside a secure government facility was a serious crime. She began her rounds on the basement level, timing her arrival to coincide with the technical operations team's morning briefing upstairs. The locker room where staff stored personal belongings was empty when she entered. She moved quickly, locating Marchand's locker by the name tag. It wasn't locked, a common oversight among people who felt safe in a secure facility. Inside, she found his jacket, his gym bag, and a small backpack that looked promising. Her hands trembled as she unzipped the backpack and found a laptop, personal model, not government-issued. This was what she needed. She pulled out the data transfer device and connected it to the laptop's USB port. The device's indicator light glowed red as it worked, copying files. Irene counted seconds, listening for any sound of approaching footsteps. The briefing upstairs typically lasted 15 minutes. She'd been in the locker room for less than 3. The light turned green. Transfer complete. Irene disconnected the device and carefully returned everything to exactly how she'd found it. She was zipping the backpack closed when she heard voices in the corridor outside. Male voices, speaking French. One of them was Marchand. Irene's training kicked in before conscious thought could paralyze her. She closed Marchand's locker silently, grabbed her cleaning supplies, and moved to the sink area as if she'd been cleaning the mirrors. By the time Marchand and another technician entered the locker room, she was wiping down the counter with the methodical movements of someone performing routine maintenance. "The cleaning woman," Marchand said to his companion, barely glancing at Irene. "They're everywhere in this building." His companion, a technician Irene recognized as Paul Devereux, laughed. "Like ghosts. You forget they're even here." They continued their conversation in English, apparently not considering that cleaning staff might understand them. "The system test tonight has to be perfect," Marchand said, opening his locker. "Any errors and Petit will be watching too closely." "What time?" Devereux asked. "After midnight. During the maintenance window. I'll need about 20 minutes of exclusive access to the relay servers." "Another optimization?" Devereux's tone carried a hint of skepticism that Marchand didn't seem to notice. "Data flow improvement," Marchand replied smoothly. "It'll increase processing efficiency by 15%. Irene continued cleaning, her heart pounding but her hands steady. "A system test after midnight, requiring exclusive access to the relay servers. The same servers that processed incoming intelligence intercepts. The same servers that would have handled the activation phrase communication." She finished the mirrors and moved toward the exit, pushing her cart past Marchand and Devereux without making eye contact. As she left, she heard Devereux say something that made her blood run cold. "You know, Petit's been asking questions about those metadata inconsistencies from last week. Might want to have a good explanation ready." Marchand's response was too quiet for her to hear, but his tone carried an edge of tension that confirmed what Irene had suspected. There were metadata inconsistencies, and the technical supervisor had noticed them. If Petit was investigating, it meant that the evidence of manipulation might already be documented in system logs. Back in the custodial closet, Irene examined the data transfer device. The files from Marchand's laptop would need to be analyzed carefully, but she couldn't do that on the intelligence center's network. She would have to wait until she got home, would have to spend the rest of her shift pretending that nothing had changed while knowing that in less than 12 hours, Marchand would have another opportunity to manipulate the intelligence systems. At 2 p.m., during her lunch break, Irene made a decision. She couldn't wait for perfect evidence or for permission from authorities who had already dismissed her. If Marchand was planning another manipulation tonight, she needed to stop him or at least document what he was doing. That meant being in the building after midnight, in areas where she had no authorization to be, essentially conducting surveillance on a government employee without any legal authority. She called Fournier from a secure phone, speaking carefully in case the line was monitored. "I need to work late tonight. Special cleaning project in the basement. Will anyone question that?" Fournier understood immediately. "It's irregular but not unprecedented. Submit a maintenance request form citing equipment deep cleaning. I'll approve it through channels. But Irene, if you're doing what I think you're doing, be extremely careful. The security protocols after hours are much stricter." "I understand. And if anything goes wrong, I can't protect you. You'll be on your own." "I've been on my own since they reassigned me to cleaning duty," Irene replied. "I'm used to it." That evening, she submitted the maintenance request form, citing a need for deep cleaning of the technical operations area equipment. The approval came through within an hour, giving her official clearance to be in the building until 2 a.m. It was a thin cover, but it was enough to explain her presence if questioned. At 11:30 p.m., Irene entered the intelligence center through the service entrance. The night shift was minimal, mostly security personnel and a handful of analysts working urgent cases. The building had a different quality at night, quieter but somehow more intense, as if the secrets it contained became more palpable in the darkness. She made her way to the basement, pushing her cleaning cart loaded with equipment she wouldn't need. The technical operations area was empty when she arrived, all the workstations dark except for the glow of standby indicators. She positioned herself in a small equipment closet that gave her a view of Marchand's workstation through a partially open door. At 12:17 a.m., Marchand arrived. He didn't seem surprised by the empty office or the late hour. He moved with the confidence of someone following a routine, someone who had done this before. He logged into his workstation and began pulling up system access screens that Irene recognized as administrator-level controls. She activated a small camera she'd borrowed from Fournier's surveillance equipment, angling it to capture Marchand's screens. Whatever he was about to do, she would have documentation. Not just her word against his, but visual proof of his actions. For the next 18 minutes, Irene watched as Marchand systematically accessed the relay servers and began modifying data processing protocols. She couldn't see all the details from her position, but she could see enough to know that he was altering how certain intercepts would be flagged and routed. He was creating blind spots in the intelligence center's ability to detect threats, deliberate vulnerabilities that would allow specific communications to pass through unnoticed or be automatically downgraded in priority. Marchand worked with practiced efficiency, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the rhythm of someone who had performed these actions multiple times. Every few minutes, he would pause to check something on his personal phone, comparing what appeared to be instructions or codes against the changes he was making to the system. Irene's camera captured everything, but she knew that video alone might not be enough. She needed context, needed to understand exactly what he was modifying and why. More importantly, she needed to know if there were others involved beyond Marchand and Rousseau. A conspiracy of this scope couldn't function with just two people. At 12:34 a.m., Marchand's phone buzzed. He answered it immediately, speaking in low tones that Irene couldn't quite hear from her hiding place. His body language changed, becoming tense and alert. He glanced around the office as if sensing that he wasn't alone, and Irene pressed herself deeper into the equipment closet's shadows. The call lasted less than a minute. When it ended, Marchand's demeanor had shifted. He began working faster, almost frantically, pulling up additional screens and making changes that seemed more aggressive than his earlier modifications. Something had changed. Whatever instructions he'd received on that call had made him accelerate his timeline. Irene's mind raced through the implications. If Marchand was rushing, it might mean that the attack wasn't 8 days away as the pattern suggested. It might be sooner. It might be imminent. She needed to act, but how? Confronting Marchand alone in an empty basement would be dangerous and pointless. Calling security would require explaining what she was doing in the equipment closet with surveillance equipment. Going to Fournier or Laurent without complete evidence would result in dismissal and possible arrest for unauthorized surveillance. The decision was made for her when Marchand suddenly stood up, his chair rolling back with enough force to bang against the desk behind him. "I know you're there," he said in French, his voice carrying across the empty office. "The camera reflection in my monitor. Very amateur." Irene's heart stopped. She'd been so focused on capturing his actions that she hadn't considered that the camera lens might reflect light visible on his screens. Amateur indeed. Her training should have prevented such a basic mistake, but months of cleaning floors had dulled her operational instincts. She stayed silent, hoping he was bluffing, but Marchand walked directly toward the equipment closet. "Come out, or I call security and tell them I've discovered an intruder in a restricted area. Either way, you're finished." Irene stepped out of the closet, the camera still in her hand. In the harsh fluorescent light of the technical operations area, she and Marchand faced each other across a space of perhaps 10 feet. He looked younger than she'd thought, probably not yet 30, with the kind of face that would be easy to overlook in a crowd. Unremarkable except for the intelligence in his eyes and the tattoo on his wrist that was now fully visible. "You're Irene Hill," Marchand said, recognition dawning on his face. "The analyst they demoted to cleaning staff. I heard about you. Too emotional, too unstable." He smiled without humor. "And yet here you are, conducting unauthorized surveillance like a trained operative." "What you're doing is treason," Irene said, keeping her voice steady. "You're compromising intelligence systems to facilitate terrorist attacks." "I'm optimizing data flows," Marchand replied smoothly. "Improving system efficiency. If you're suggesting something else, you'll need to prove it." And I don't think the testimony of a disgraced analyst who's currently breaking multiple security protocols is going to carry much weight. He was right, and they both knew it. Irene was in an unauthorized area, conducting unauthorized surveillance, with a history of emotional instability on her record. Even with the video evidence, her credibility was destroyed before she could present it. How many people are going to die? Irene asked quietly. How many innocent people are you helping to murder? For just a moment, something flickered in Marchand's eyes. Doubt? Guilt? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You don't understand what you're interfering with. This is bigger than you, bigger than this building. Walk away, Hill. Go back to cleaning toilets and forget what you've seen. I can't do that. Then you'll leave me no choice. Marchand pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over what Irene assumed was a speed dial to security. Last chance. Walk away, or I'll have you arrested for espionage. And unlike you, I have credibility in this building. Irene's mind worked through the scenarios with the analytical speed that had once made her a top analyst. If she let Marchand call security, she'd be arrested and the evidence she'd gathered would be confiscated. The investigation would be handled by people who might be compromised or who would follow protocols that took too long. The attack would proceed, and hundreds would die. But if she acted now, if she used the combat training that was part of every intelligence officer's background regardless of their specialization, she might be able to stop Marchand long enough to send the evidence to Fournier and Director General Moreau. It was a desperate choice, but desperation was all she had left. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats. Before Marchand could react, before he could complete the call to security, Irene moved with speed that surprised them both. The camera dropped from her hand as she closed the distance between them, using techniques she'd learned years ago and practiced in secret during her months of exile. Not to harm, but to disarm and restrain. Marchand was younger and stronger, but he wasn't expecting an attack from someone he dismissed as a glorified janitor. The phone clattered to the floor as Irene secured his arm behind his back and drove him toward the nearest desk. I'm sorry, she said, meaning it. But I can't let you make that call. 3 months later, Irene Hill stood in a conference room that she'd once cleaned at 4 a.m. But today, she wore the uniform of a senior analyst in the newly created Internal Security Division, her credentials hanging from a lanyard that granted her access to the highest levels of classified intelligence. Director General Moreau stood at the front of the room, addressing an assembly of European intelligence officials from a dozen countries. The reforms we're implementing today exist because one analyst refused to accept that her demotion meant her observations didn't matter. Because she understood that rank doesn't determine insight, and authority doesn't guarantee wisdom. He gestured toward Irene. Specialist Hill identified a systemic vulnerability that had been exploited for months. She recognized patterns that our best analysts had missed. And she did it while working as custodial staff, using nothing but her intelligence, her determination, and her absolute refusal to let institutional dismissal define her capabilities. The room erupted in applause. Irene felt her cheeks flush, still uncomfortable with recognition after so many months of invisibility. But she stood straight, accepting the acknowledgement not for herself but for what it represented, a fundamental change in how the intelligence community valued unconventional thinking in dissenting voices. After the ceremony, Fournier found her in the corridor. How does it feel to be the most celebrated analyst in European counterterrorism? Surreal, Irene admitted. 3 months ago, I was emptying trash bins and being told I was too emotional for intelligence work. Now I'm designing reforms for threat assessment protocols across 12 countries. You were always this capable, Fournier said. The only thing that changed is that people finally had to acknowledge it. Later that afternoon, Irene returned to her new office, a space with windows and a door that locked and a nameplate that read Senior Analyst, Internal Security Division. On her desk was a framed photograph from the morning they'd prevented the attacks, counterterrorism teams in 3 cities, simultaneous raids, 23 arrests that had dismantled a network that had been operating undetected for over a year. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When she opened it, she found a simple message: "Thank you for not giving up. You saved my daughter's life. She takes the metro to school every morning in Paris. One of the targeted stations. I will never forget what you did. A grateful mother. Irene read the message 3 times, feeling tears sting her eyes. This was why she'd risked everything. Not for recognition or validation, but for the mothers and daughters and countless others who would never know how close they'd come to tragedy. They would ride the metro, would walk through train stations, would go about their lives completely unaware that an invisible woman with a cleaning cart had stood between them and death. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the months of humiliation and dismissal, about the night she'd confronted Marchand alone in a basement with nothing but her conviction that she was right. About the choice between following protocols and following her conscience. In the end, it hadn't been her analytical skills that saved those lives, though those skills had been essential. It had been her refusal to accept that being dismissed meant being wrong. Her understanding that sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, done by people others have decided don't matter. Irene Hill had been assigned cleanup duty. But she'd found something far more important than evidence. She'd found proof that determination and integrity could overcome institutional prejudice, that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage, and that the people society overlooks are often the ones who see most clearly. She'd been invisible. And in that invisibility, she'd changed everything. The attacks that never happened would never make headlines. The lives saved would never know they'd been saved. But in offices across Europe, in intelligence centers and security briefings, people were asking new questions. Who else have we dismissed? What other voices have we silenced? How many other Irene Hills are cleaning our floors while we miss the patterns they could see? The reforms would take years to implement fully. Changing institutional culture was harder than preventing a single attack. But the conversation had begun, sparked by a young woman who'd refused to let her demotion define her worth. As evening settled over Brussels, Irene looked out her office window at the city she'd helped protect. Some were down there, people were heading home from work, students were meeting friends for dinner, families were gathering for evening meals. All of them safe because someone had cared enough to look beyond her assigned duties and see the larger mission. She'd been told she was too emotional for intelligence work. But emotion, passion, the absolute conviction that every life mattered, that had been her greatest strength all along. Not a weakness to overcome, but a superpower to embrace. Irene Hill had proven that the smallest voice in the room could deliver the most important message. That being underestimated was sometimes exactly what you needed to see what others missed. And that sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the one person who can save them all. The building was quieter now, most staff having left for the day. In the distance, she could hear the familiar sound of a cleaning cart's wheels on tile flooring. The night custodial staff beginning their rounds, invisible to most people, essential to everyone. Irene smiled and got back to work. She had reports to write, protocols to reform, and a system to change. But first, she made a note to introduce herself to the night cleaning staff. To learn their names, to listen to their observations, to ensure that no one in this building would ever again be dismissed simply because their job didn't come with a prestigious title. After all, she'd learned the most important lesson that intelligence work could teach: the truth doesn't care about your rank, and insight doesn't require authorization. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from the people you least expect, in the places you never think to look. And she would make certain that lesson was never forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.